Volodymyr Zelensky, president of Ukraine, appears to believe that he is winning his war against Russia, or at the very least, that Russia is losing, and that with just a little bit more time, a little bit more effort, and definitely a lot more money, he can bring off a victory for his people. Now, you may think that sounds awfully delusional, but he does have some evidence to suggest that there is some reason for his optimism, both from the alliance as well as on some of the parts of the battlefield as well. But as we're also going to see, those are maybe deceptive signals that he sent, and somebody who will interpret events to the advantage that what they want to see, as opposed to what's actually there. Because as we've been talking since the beginning of this war, and it's certainly no different today, the evidence on the ground in totality, from strategic all the way through operational to tactical, definitely says that Ukraine will lose the war. It's only a matter of time for a number of reasons. But let's get into some of those, why Zelensky may think that he's actually in a good position. First of all, at a conference yesterday, he was asked a number of questions about, he was asked about an upcoming meeting with Trump himself, and he was very eager to announce that the United States, for the first time under the Trump administration, has signed 2 new arms packages to Ukraine.
We have received more than $2 billion in funding from our partners specifically for the PRO program. We expect additional funding in October, and I believe we will reach approximately $3.5 to $3.6 billion. The first 2 packages amount to $500 million each. I will not disclose all the details, but I can confirm that they will include missiles for Patriot and HIMARS systems. Our teams are working to ensure that the meeting takes place.
Okay, so remember that statement that he just made there. He thinks that there's more money coming, and by October, it could be another about $3.6 billion coming from the United States, apparently, or from whatever other sources. But he thinks more is coming, 3.6. Remember that number. But let's take a look at this number, 2 packages of $500 million. And he says that they are going to include a majority of Patriots and HIMARS. Now, Patriots, of course, are for air defense. That's what they need to try and limit the amount of Russian missiles and drones that are coming in on nearly a nightly basis. And then the HIMARS are to launch long-range fires into Russia. Now, one wonders, how much longer Russia will be fine with the U.S. now adding to its long-range capability for Ukraine, so they're not just the Ukrainian drones, which have been having some success launching against oil facilities inside of Russia. Now, apparently, we're going to give them some more HIMARS. Thing is, we got to understand, the HIMARS, there's a reason you don't hear much about them, not because they don't exist, but because shortly after coming into the war itself under the Biden administration, the Russian side figured out how to use electronic warfare means to defeat them and to make them far, far less capable than they were before. They were able to drive them off course, make them just go anywhere else besides their intended target. So it may land in an open field somewhere. It may land somewhere it's not supposed to. But the problem is it doesn't land where it's supposed to. Now, as I've pointed out several times over the last couple of years in particular, that's a problem for us, by the way, because that is in our inventory and one of the things we use. And so now then, should we get into a ground war really anywhere that even has friendly relations with Russia, i.e. China, possibly North Korea, maybe even Iran again, et cetera, you can count on it that they're going to have the technology and the information, the technical knowledge of how to defeat the HIMARS. So we're going to start the next conflict already in a deficit of effectiveness of the HIMARS, as opposed to when they were first employed. There was actually a pretty high success rate. You may recall the Antonovsky Bridge down in the Zaporizhia area over the Dnipro River. That was a big issue because they severely weakened that and caused Russia a lot of trouble, which ended up being the real reason why they ended up giving up the Kherson city, because they couldn't get across. The logistics were going to be put at risk, and they said they could end up getting cut off, so they ended up not doing it. But then you didn't hear a whole lot more of them afterwards, and that's the reason why. So not a big celebration, big number, relatively speaking, $500 million, 2 of those packages. Now then, we also have to look at his issue of that he wants more money. So $3.6 billion is coming. I'm going to get to a point here in a second where we're going to show you, put that in context, because again, that sounds like a big number. One of the things this really highlights here, and I think it's important to point out, This is now President Trump's war, period. He can't even, it would be laughable to claim, as he has in some recent days, not as much as he used to, this is Biden's war. This would never have happened if I had been president. Okay, you weren't, though. So that no longer matters. I still think that there is some validity to that. I think if President Trump had been president then, there probably wouldn't have been, because he didn't want a war with Russia, and he would have been willing to make some kind of a negotiation or a deal. I don't think he certainly wouldn't have done what Biden did, which is stop talking to Russia and then, do this whole coalition of the willing and these 50 nations at the defense base in Ramstein, and as long as it takes, and all that kind of stuff that Biden did, which was disastrous for us. So Trump, though, now came into office saying he was going to get this done, and he had so many opportunities, and he still hasn't done it. He's had personal direct meetings, the most recent being the big song and dance in Alaska. Didn't produce anything. Didn't produce a ceasefire, didn't produce any changes in the Russian position. And now then you see that the only change that Trump has had is that he has gone back on his thing to not provide weapons. Now, of course, he'll say, this is just money we make because we're not giving Ukraine anything. Look, the issue is not really who's paying for them. There's some issue with it. But the biggest issue, how many weapons do we have to give? And our industrial base cannot produce enough, and we don't have enough in our inventory. So the only thing you're going to do is continue to draw down our inventories and prevent us from rebuilding those inventories, because whatever does come out of the industrial base is going to have to go towards going to Ukraine, because $1 billion a month sounds like a lot of money, but in comparison to the final one in the Biden administration of $61 billion, you can see it's just chump change in overall situation. So if that didn't make any difference, I don't know why anybody thinks this one will, which is much, much smaller, but he does. There is no chance that these long-range HIMARS or the Patriot systems are going to change anything in the operational and strategic balance here, because those things are driven by other issues. So then we have to ask, Zelensky has to answer, President Trump has to answer, okay, you're giving them more of this weapon systems and more ammunition and more of these categories that are useful, but in such small quantities, and everything that Biden had done, that Europe had done, especially in 2022 and 2023, and they didn't change anything. Why do you propose this one will? And there's no answer. There's no answer given. There is an answer, and the answer is it won't. So we're just going to continue to kick the can down the road again, make it look like we're doing something, make it look like we're keeping pressure on Russia, but all it's doing is just continuing the death and destruction on the Ukraine side. Well, then what gets into Zelensky thinking that he actually has a chance? What is it that he says, no, we have a shot to succeed here? Well, and according to his view, the Russians had been going under basically a four-pronged attack for a majority of this part of the year, and he says two of those aren't working.
4 primary directions have been identified by the Russian Federation across all documents and intelligence data. The Sumy direction, the Sumy offensive, the Novopavlivka operation, the Pokrovsk operation as one of the main ones, and the Zaporizhzhia direction. The Sumy operation failed. They suffered heavy losses, primarily in personnel. As of today, and while I cannot speak hypothetically about what might happen tomorrow, at this very moment, they have completely abandoned that particular direction and have redeployed both their assets and personnel to other locations. I believe they suffered even greater losses in that new direction. They will continue to maintain and carry out only 2 separate operations for the time being. The Russian side has lost a significant number of personnel, which has limited their ability to carry out further large-scale operations.
Okay, we keep hearing that comment there that Russia has lost significant numbers of people. It's 1.5 million, 1 million, depending on who you want to listen to, on what day of the week it is. Never any evidence actually given. Never any evidence actually given. You don't see, let's see, I think it was Alex from History Legends has famously done a lot of videos on this, where he uses tremendous amounts of video footage, and he asks the rhetorical question, where are these hundreds of thousands of Russian bodies that we hear are going into this meat grinder over and over, and we don't have any. In fact, the videos that we do have are small groups, 2 and 3, sometimes 4 or 5 groups going in at a time, because they have dispersed operations. That doesn't equal half or 1.5 million Russian casualties. Now, maybe there's something that I don't know about. I don't have any personal knowledge about this. I just look at the battlefield and I see what's presented and what's provided. And I think it's pretty unlikely that Russia is suffering that many casualties. Meanwhile, there is some evidence that the Ukraine side is suffering those kinds of numbers in casualties, and you see that in the repatriation of bodies. The ratio is always wildly out of proportion, with Russia providing Ukrainian soldier killed in action as opposed to the Ukraine repatriating Russians that were killed. I mean, huge difference. I think the biggest one was 19 Russians and 1,000 Ukrainians or so. There's been others that weren't quite that big disparity, but they're all huge disparities. So that gives you an indication and an idea. But then you see also these claims by so many on the Ukraine side about how that they are running short of manpower, how they're having a lot of people desert, and how there's a lot of the forward positions, they don't have enough people to man them, etc. So that implies that actually the Ukraine side is losing a lot of people. But let's take a look at what he's talking about here, because Zelensky said 2 of 4 areas that he identified are not going anywhere. One of the ones he mentions is the Sumy area. And let's see, let's back off up to here a little bit. This is in the Sumy territory here. Now, you may recall that the Ukraine side had a Kursk operation, and they went up into a lot of this area right here in August of 2024. And then Russia methodically over a number of months ended up pushing them back. And then they went for more than just pushing them back. They went into Sumy here. Now, when this first happened, a lot of people said, the city of Sumy is now under threat. And they had apparently, the Ukraine side had started withdrawing people. And then that's kind of it. And then it kind of stopped here. Now, what we don't know is that as far as Russia wanted to go, or was that as far as Russia could go? So it could well be that Ukraine had enough personnel, enough arms, enough ammunition to prevent Russia from going any further. And maybe that is a Ukrainian tactical victory. So we can't say, but what we can say for certain is that is as far as it went. And it's basically been that way for a long time. Now, you see these gray areas here, that indicates that there are still active engagements going on. There's still basically cross-border fires going in both directions. So it's still an active combat zone, but there's not any territory really changing positions here. So that one has been pretty stabilized for quite a while. And then, of course, you get down to the Kharkiv area, and they made some initial movements across, but then that also petered out. Again, we don't know if that's as far as they wanted to go or as far as they could go, but there continues to be clashes along the front line. So Ukraine has to keep some number of troops here. Russia keeps some number of troops here, same with Sumy. But now we start moving into some other areas, and it's not quite such good news. Let's go first to Kupiansk. Now, this is we talk about this a lot, and you see that both the red zone over in here and the gray zone continues to expand deeper and deeper into the city of Kupiansk. And that tells you that the fighting is pretty strong here. Now, you may recall that Russia made a pretty big move here about a month or so ago, and then Ukraine sent reinforcements in to try and push them back. Well, they did a little bit around some of the flanks on here on both the inside and the outside of that penetration, but as you're going to see a repeating theme here, they were not able to completely cut it off. So the Russians continue to have this issue here. And then, of course, that gives them the ability to launch raids really into the city from nearly every direction, at least, 180 degrees across the front. So that continues to keep the Ukraine side inside of Kupiansk more and more troubled. Then the other area he mentioned was the Pokrovsk area, and we have a little bit of changes in there, but you're going to see a continuing theme about that as well. And that is, you recall, I believe it was in, I think early August, where Russia had this big penetration, this big breakthrough. There was 2 prongs that they had moved up, mainly with DRG groups, which is small groups of destruction and reconnaissance groups. And then they tried to move more folks into it. And then the Ukraine side sent the Azov Corps to try and check the advance, and then they tried for a period of time to cut it off, and they did knock out this one. You see, this used to be in red, now it's just in the gray zone, so that means nobody has real full control over it. You may recall also that the Ukraine side was trying to have a pincher action where they were going to attack into this area here, and from this area down here to try and completely cut off this whole thing, and they haven't been successful at doing that. And of course, they continue to suffer casualties as they try to do this really across all of these areas. But the bottom line is, in the northern part of the Pokrovsk, Ukraine continues to have these battles, and they continue to not be successful with their counterattacks. Meanwhile, now in the last 24 hours or so, Russia has apparently tried again, maybe their third attempt to move deeper into the city of Pokrovsk. And we see now that there's been some additional Russian gains. This is kind of going back and forth. Sometimes Russians move in there, sometimes they're pushed back. Now then Russia has tried again, and you see that they have a couple of different penetrations here in the north and in the south central part. This, of course, as I think we pointed out before, these areas right here are the citadels inside of Pokrovsk, where the main defense is, because there are a lot of high-rise buildings. It's very difficult to get the Ukraine side out. So that's kind of their linchpin. Now it looks like Russia may try to move into some of the less defended areas, more accessible, to try and just continue to peel some of this off. But again, the bottom line is casualties continue to pile up for the Ukraine side. Now, let's go back down a little bit further here to Ivanivska. Now, you may recall also a month and a half or so ago, the Ukraine side had a pretty good sized counterattack and actually put this had been all Russian, and they pushed them all the way back to quite a bit of area back down here. And the question is, how much staying power would they have? Now, I think at the time I pointed out that, look, the bottom line is Ukraine doesn't have the staying power and the endurance capacity to have these big offensives and then to keep them going. And now we're seeing it play out exactly that way. And now Russia has methodically been pushing them back. And so what was Ukrainian territory is now in the gray zone. And the gray zones continue around here as well. So Russia slowly is moving back into that area around Ivanivka. Let's see. And the one other one that I think I want to look at here is the Zaporizhia, because that's one of the things that Zelensky mentioned. And there hasn't been a lot of movement, but there's still a lot of clashes going in the gray zone. You see there is this one area here where Russia did move back, and you can zoom in here, and you can see that it's a number of streets that have gone on. It's not a huge one, but it is moving forward. And that's kind of what we see across the board with almost all of these movements. Ukraine goes into the Kursk region. They don't have staying power. So they ended up losing reportedly somewhere around 70,000 killed in action. I don't know how many wounded, probably triple that number. Then after 7 or 8 months, they were pushed back out. And then now you have these counterattacks in all these different areas, and they have some success at first, and then it peters out because they don't have the staying power. Meanwhile, when the Russians have penetrations here and there, the Ukraine side has to pull people out of one part of the front to get them to go as a fire brigade to try to stop the penetration in another point. But even there, they have so limited number of response forces and reserves that they can't plug all the holes in the dike. So they continue to lose troops, and they continue to lose territory. And again, it's very small. And you have people over and over talking about, yeah, it's so small. That's actually an evidence of Russia losing. You may recall General Keith Kellogg in a conference in Kiev on Sunday said, yeah, I see that they're making all these small moves, but really that's an evidence that they are losing.
If he was winning, he'd be in Kiev. If he was winning, he'd be west of the Dnieper River. If he was winning, he'd be on Odessa. If he was winning, he would have changed the government. Russia is, in fact, losing this war. They may make movements and say, so, well, they're advancing in the Donbass region and the Donetsk. But if you consider advancing moving by meters, not miles, well then, okay, that's successful. But at the cost they're having, it's enormous. But the numbers they have lost, when you're talking dead and wounded, well over 1 million. They left Afghanistan after losing 18,000. We left Vietnam after losing 65,000. They've lost over 1 million dead or wounded. These numbers are World War II level numbers. And their first line units that they came and tried to take Kyiv with a little over four years ago, those first-line units are gone. So they've gone through a second or a third or fourth iteration of wartime commanders. Russia is, in fact, losing this war.
You know, one of the things I haven't made comment on there is he made this observation that the Russian army that came into Ukraine in 2022 has been destroyed, and then they've had several iterations after that. That is true. That is an accurate statement. But that is not good for our side. It's not good for the Ukraine side, because what has replaced that army is much more efficient, much more knowledgeable, and has a lot more hardened combat experience, and they are proving that on the battlefield by increasing the firepower and increasing the lethality on the Ukraine side while preserving their own numbers. So now that, because they made a lot of mistakes early on, there was a couple of just disastrous river crossings where they had an entire battalion basically wiped out because of just terrible decisions and lack of experience on the ground, et cetera. So he's right; those got burned off. But in their place, and this is the same thing we saw in the American Army in World War II. We had a lot of horrific casualties and losses. Especially in the first North African fight at Al-Qatar, I believe it was, Kasserine Pass. Sorry, the guitar turned out to be a success later, but Kasserine Pass was just disastrous because we just didn't know what we were doing. We didn't have the experience, and we suffered a lot. Well, that got burned off. They brought in George Patton after that, and things had turned around a little bit different after that point. Russians kind of in the same position. The other thing that he doesn't talk about at all, is that there are two sides to this equation. He points out to his perceived cost on the Russian side, doesn't even address that on the Ukraine side. Fortunately for you, I will look at both sides. So yes, Russia has lost some number of troops. I don't know how many it is. I hear some pretty wildly different numbers. Some say it's hardly any, and some say it's 1.5 million. Truth is probably somewhere in between. But here's the thing, even if it was on the higher end of this, Russia has the number of troops and mobilization potential that they can offset those losses. Ukraine side doesn't. Russia did an initial mobilization of 300,000 in, I think it was October of 2022, because they had just been routed in the Kharkiv area in the north and in the Kherson area in the south, and they didn't have time to try and rebuild their force, through mobilization or through recruitment. They had to force mobilize about 300,000. They did. They plugged the gaps, et cetera. Then they spent a full year just going on the defense while they started building up their army and doing retraining, et cetera. And that is where they made their money. They took the opportunity to actually just invest a year to say, all right, we're just going to hold the line here while we're going to be building our army later on. They did that. And of course, they're also building the defense industrial capacity, and all those things are now, ramifications are pretty evident on the battlefield. But on the other side of this calculation, things are not quite so good. As a matter of fact, we've told you here before, but General Sersky has recently publicly said that the Russian has a threefold advantage on the front line, and in some areas it can prevail by 4 to 6 times. So that tells you that if more than 3.5 years into this, you have a 3 to 6 times loss in some of the key areas there, that tells you it's unsustainable. So you can say, well, yes, the Ukraine side has only lost meters instead of miles, and there's certainly some truth to that, but you see you're losing manpower. You see the physical results of it. Another evidence of that, I could talk about the desertion rates. It's huge. It's depending on who you want to ask. I've seen some estimates as low as 250 per day. I've seen other estimates as high as 700 per day on the Ukraine side. Don't know which of those numbers is right. A lot of this stuff, like so many of these numbers, will only be known long into the future when historians are able to go back and look at records, et cetera. But it's very clearly a pretty substantial number. We've had additional information here of late that the forced mobilization on the Ukraine side is now getting the recruiters themselves, or the guys who are responsible to mobilize these people. They're getting some of them killed, and there's lots of fights going on along that. Now then, we also see, this didn't get much notice. This is actually from July. The President Volodymyr Zelensky signed a new law allowing Ukrainian people over 60 to join the armed forces. Again, that was over the 3-year mark, nearly the 3.5-year mark at the time this was signed. The law will allow them to sign a 1-year contract, and it says a significant number of citizens aged 60 and over have expressed a strong desire to voluntarily join the defense state. Yeah, I mean, dude, I'm 62. I would not volunteer to go fight in a war where all these young men are already getting slaughtered. You just can't. I mean, I like to think I'm in pretty good shape for a 62-year-old man, but I'm a 62-year-old man. And so when that is what you're relying on, and of course, that is what happened to the Nazi army in Germany toward the end of World War II, when the war was clearly lost and they were bringing in kids and old men, et cetera. And that's what we're doing here. Now, they say, well, that's just to, they want to bring those guys into non-combat jobs, and there's some logic in that. But that's so that they can free up other guys to come to the front who don't want to come and any more than the guys they force mobilize off the street. So those are all continuing notifications that this is not going to work. Now, earlier in this show here, I told you, remember what Zelensky said in that second soundbite, I think, that He says that he thinks there's more money is coming by October of this year. He thought he could get up to $3.6 billion additionally on top of that. Okay, so let's put that in context. In the Ukrainian media today, there is a notice, and I think that this was actually made at that same press conference that we showed you some of the sound bites from. But he says that the price of war is $120 billion a year. $60 billion comes from our own budget, and I need to find another $60 billion. Zelensky told reporters in Kiev during a briefing with European Parliament President Roberta Metsola on Wednesday. I hope we will end this war, but in any case, we will have two options. Plan A, end the war. Plan B, secure $120 billion. And this is a huge challenge. So he just told you that he might have 3.6 next month. And I'm not aware of anybody else who's even talking about anything more than that, because just to be clear, that number there he's talking about is to sustain the budget, to pay the civil servants, to keep the railroad running, to keep the other kinds of public transportation, etc., just to keep the country functioning. Because they don't have an economy, basically. It's been utterly destroyed, and the only thing they can do is get massive infusions from outside sources, or they can't even function as a country. So he's saying, this is the first time I've seen him say this, and he didn't elaborate, and it's nothing that I've been able to see. Plan A, we just end the war this year. Well, what does that mean? End the war by what means? And the implication being we'll just lose it, or we'll have to negotiate something to an end, because if I don't get that much money, then I'm not going to be able to continue, though. I mean, we won't physically be able to continue the war. Now, back in July, on July 3rd, the president of the European Union, Ursula von der Leyen, made an impassioned plea for $150 billion from their European counterparts.
I, from my part, can only recommend to use now SAFE. Here are 150 billion euros. The member states can take this money and either buy military equipment and give it to Ukraine, or they can take this money and invest it in the extremely efficient Ukrainian defense industry. President Zelensky told us that this defense industry, which is highly efficient, has a capacity where only 60% are being used, so there's room for more 40% of capacity.
Okay, so she's trying really hard to sell this. It's a great deal. Only 40% of the capacity, or only 60% of the capacity is being used, and you can vote this extremely efficient process. I mean, these people in that room aren't stupid. I mean, they know there's a war going on there. They know that Russia has, if not control of the skies, it is very porous. Because even, I think, in the last big strike, where there was over 800 projectiles earlier this month, Ukraine claims that they shot down all but about 80 of them. But that means 80 of them are still flying all around the country. And every day, practically, there's a bunch that don't get shot down, even in their claims, much less what may actually be going on. And what are they hitting? They're hitting energy infrastructure. They're hitting railroads. So it's making it more difficult to move things around in the country, i.e. to get spare parts or raw materials necessary to run these factories. They're hitting the energy infrastructure to knock out the energy capacity so you can't operate the machinery. And then they're going after the factories themselves. And it's always a race to see if we can keep it hidden, and it's so difficult because Russia has spies all over the place. They have aerial intelligence, and they're doing everything they can to figure out where these things are, and then they attack them. So who's going to be signing up to give $150 billion on this great business opportunity? Well, as it turns out, a few days later, after this July the 10th, so a week or so later, the EU announces 2.3 billion euros in Ukraine. And that's reconstruction support. That means after the war, we're contributing here. That's not for continuing the war this year. So far, since that impassioned plea, that there hasn't been anyone forthcoming. In fact, the only money that apparently has been allocated is this $1 billion in the two $500 million packages that Zelensky referred to the United States, because Trump already said, I ain't paying for nothing. I'll sell you stuff, and as long as NATO and European countries buy it, and then we'll shuttle it on over there. So that's $1 billion. So he thinks maybe he's going to get another 3.6 billion. Okay, that's 4.6 out of the 60 that you say you need. So where is that coming from? And I'm not even sure where he thinks he's going to get 60 out of his own efforts. Maybe they have some kind of a tax base. I mean, it's not literally completely destroyed, so they have some. But let's say that it's only the 60 amount, and you've got now four or five, kind of short of 60. Folks, the clock is ticking. And so if this is one of the rare admissions of honesty from Zelensky, then we may get to the point to where they physically can't survive, not even on the front lines, not even among their troops. But if they can't move raw materials around, if they can't transport troops around, if they can't even pay their civil servants, and so the services that the government provides can't be done, I mean, the whole thing could come to a standstill. And so far, nobody's been signing up to pay for this huge amount of $60 billion. We'll see how that goes. We're going to continue to watch that over the coming days. But this thing could continue to go down, because he's saying, yeah, I need 120 billion just to keep the war going next year, with no plan, no rational path to how you're ever going to succeed. I mean, okay, General Kellogg, if you want to say that Russia's going slow, so they're losing, well, they're still going slow. I've never seen a case where you see that someone is advancing and that somehow is twisted around to be an evidence that they're losing. I mean, that's irrational. Whether it's fast or really slow, it's still an advance. And your side keeps going back, and they keep suffering casualties, and you don't have the raw materials, and either personnel or equipment or ammunition to replace the losses. And now then we're getting into a situation where the Europeans and the Western world has given so much money as we roll toward the 4-year mark of this. They just don't have it. They just don't have it. And at what point are we finally going to say, all right, this is stupid? We don't have the money to give, and we keep harming ourselves in this idea that we should now go on secondary sanctions on China, India, Brazil, to force them to stop doing oil with Russia, which they're not going to do. And even if they did, Russia can absorb those losses. They've already shown that they have an ability to do that. They'll find other means of getting their oil out and to keep the revenues, at least something going on. I mean, Russia's too big of a country. You tried to isolate it. You utterly failed. At some point, we're going to start saying in the West that, look, I get it, man. This is what we wanted to happen, but now there's no path to do it. And to continue going down this irrational path is going to be to harm us. And that may be the one point and the one pressure point on our side that finally gets people to start doing something that makes a little bit of sense, because it's one thing to harm Russia, but it's a second thing when I'm getting harmed and Russia's not, and there's no path to do anything except see me harmed more and shell out more money I don't have. We'll have to see how that's going to work out. We're going to keep you on top of that, but really appreciate you guys today. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't, and we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.